Showing off, don't wanna have to wait tonight. Wait tonight, better off. I'm gonna find my way tonight. Wait tonight, won't you talk to me? I wanna heal your sorrow. Won't you talk to me? We'll make a new tomorrow. Won't you talk to me? What makes this happy face? Showing off, don't wanna have to wait tonight. Wait tonight, better off. I'm gonna find my way tonight. Wait tonight, won't you talk to me? I wanna heal your sorrow. Won't you talk to me? We'll make a new tomorrow. Won't you talk to me? What makes this happy face?
All right. Hello. Good evening. It is time for our next reading in Forbidden Religion. So, tonight's articles are on Fulcanelli and Isaac Newton. So, yeah. I know nothing about Fulcanelli, so this will be very informative for me. So, let's just jump straight on into it. So, this is Article 29. I believe 29 and 30 finishes up the... Nope, I was wrong. 31, 32, 33. So there's 33 total we'll get through 33, and then we get into part 6 of the book. So 29 and 30 tonight. We'll see where we're at and how long the 31st one is, and maybe we'll jump into it too. All right, Fulcanelli and the Mystery of the Cathedrals. What is the connection between the cross at Hendaye, and one of the most enigmatic figures of the 20th century? By Vincent Bridges. I guess that's Hendaye. Hendaye. I don't know. I'm not familiar. All right, so in 1926, a mysterious volume issued in a luxury edition of 300 copies by a small Paris publishing firm, known mostly for artistic reprints, rocked the Parisian occult underworld. Its title was Le Mystère des Cathédrales, The Mystery of the Cathedrals. The author, Fulcanelli, claimed that the great secret of alchemy, the queen of Western occult sciences, was plainly displayed on the walls of Paris's own cathedral, Notre Dame de Paris. Alchemy, by our postmodern lights, a quaint and discredited Renaissance pseudoscience, was in the process of being reclaimed and reconditioned in 1926 by two of the most influential movements of the century. Surrealism and psychology stumbled onto alchemy at about the same time, and each attached its own notions of its meaning to the ancient science. Carl Jung spent the 20s teasing out a theory of the archetypal unconscious from the symbolic tapestry of alchemical images and studying how these symbols are expressed in the dream state. The poet-philosopher André Breton and the surrealist made an intuitive leap of faith and proclaimed that the alchemical process could be expressed artistically. Breton, in his 1924 Surrealist Manifesto, announced that surrealism was nothing but alchemical art. Falconelli's book would have an indirect effect on both of these intellectual movements. Indirect because the book managed a major literary miracle. It became influential while remaining apparently completely unknown outside of French occult and alchemical circles. This is perhaps the strangest of all the mysteries surrounding the mystery of the cathedrals. In the fall of 1925, publisher Jean Schmidt received a visit from a small man dressed as a pre-war bohemian with a long the Gaul style mustache. The man wanted to talk about Gothic architecture, the green argot of its sculptural symbols, and how slang was a kind of punning code, which he called the quote-unquote language of the birds. A few weeks later, Schmidt was introduced to him again as Jean-Julien Champagne, the illustrator of a proposed book by a mysterious alchemist named Falconelli. Schmidt thought that all three, the visitor, the author, and the illustrator, were the same man. Perhaps they were. This, such as it is, amounts to our most credible Falconelli sighting. As such, it sums up the entire problem posed by the question, who was Falconelli? Beyond this ambiguous encounter, he exists as words on a page, and in some occult circles as a mythic alchemical immortal with the status or identity of a Saint Germain. There were two things that everyone agreed upon concerning Falconelli. He was definitely a mind to be reckoned with, and he was a true enigma. We are left, then, with the mystery of the missing master alchemist. He is a man who does not seem to exist, and yet he is recreated constantly in the imagination of every seeker, a perfect foil for projection. We might even think it was all a joke, some kind of elaborate hoax, except for the material itself. When one turns to Le Mystère, the mystery of the cathedrals, one finds a witty intelligence that seems quite sure of the nature and importance of his information. This Falconelli knows something that is trying to communicate his knowledge. Of this there can be no doubt. Falconelli's message, that there is a secret in the cathedrals, and that this secret was placed there by a group of initiates, of whom Falconelli is obviously one, depends upon an abundance of imagery and association that overpowers the intellect, lulling one into an intuitive state of acceptance. Falconelli is undoubtedly brilliant, but we are left wondering if he is the brilliance of revelation or dissimulation. The basic premise of the book, that Gothic cathedrals are hermetic books in stone, was an idea that made it into print in the 19th century in the work of Victor Hugo. In The Hunchback of Notre Dame, Hugo spends a whole chapter on the idea that architecture is the great book of humanity, and that the invention of printing and the proliferation of mundane books spelled the end of the sacred book of architecture. He reports that the Gothic era was the sacred architect's greatest achievement, that the cathedrals were expressions of liberty and the emergence of a new sense of freedom. Quote, "This freedom goes to great lengths," Hugo informs us. "Occasionally a portal, a facade, an entire church is presented in a symbolic sense entirely foreign to its creed, and even hostile to the church. In the 19th century, Guillaume of Paris, in the 15th, Nicolas Flamel, what? Oh, in the 13th century, Guillaume de Paris, in the 15th century, Nicolas Flamel, both are guilty of these seditious pages." End quote. Sorry, it didn't make sense there for a second. Essentially, Le Mystery is an in-depth examination of these seditious pages in stone. Falconelli elaborates on the symbolism of certain images found on the walls and porches of architect Guillaume of Paris's masterpiece Notre Dame Cathedral and its close contemporary Notre Dame of Amiens. To this, he adds images from two houses built in the Gothic style from 15th century Bourges. This guided tour of Hermetic symbolism is densely obscure, filled with green language, puns, and numerous allusions. To the casual reader and even the dedicated student, this tangled web of scholarship is daunting. However, to the occult savants of Paris in the late 1920s, Falconelli's book was almost intoxicating. Here, finally, was the word of a man who knew the voice of the last true initiate. His student, Eugene Cancelliet, informs us in the preface to the first edition of Le Mystère that Falconelli had accomplished the great work and then disappeared from the world. Quote, "For a long time now the author of this book has not been among us," Cancelliet wrote, and he was lamented by a group of unknown, it continues the quote, "unknown brothers who hoped to obtain from him the solution to the mysterious verbum dimissum, missing word." And that's the end quote of the quote. And there is a picture. Falconelli claimed that cathedrals such as the Cathedral of Notre Dame were hermetic books in stone with the mysteries and glories of humanity encoded in their architecture. And I assume, it's been a while since I saw pictures of it, I assume this is Notre Dame in Paris, but I don't know. Because it doesn't specifically say that's Paris. Anyway, moving on. Oh, and we go right into another picture, so I might as well just show, there's actually three on these next two pages. I'll just go ahead and show them all before I continue reading. So the next one, from the north transept of Notre Dame Cathedral, a sermon in stone. So there we go. A sermon in stone. It would take a while to really study that and see what all's going on. The next two left, so it'll be the first one I show you. Do strange symbolic inscriptions carved in the base of the cross at Hendaye contain an alchemical prophecy of the apocalypse? And then the other one is the images on the four sides of the base of the pedestal are the shield-like designs facing south, the star facing east, the sun facing west, and the moon facing north. So here is the, oops, sorry. Here is the cross they're talking about, and that base shows these four symbols. There we go. Move back in. Interesting. So there's the text if you want to read it again. I find that not this one, but this one quite interesting. That symbol that's repeated on it. Okay, I think that's the soul symbol, isn't it? Or am I misremembering? Anyway, moving on. Mystification about the true identity of the alchemist obscured the fact that credible people had seen his visiting card emblazoned with an artistic signature. It was possible to encounter people at the Chat Noir nightclub in Paris who claimed to have met Fulcanelli right through World War II. Between 1926 and 1929, his legend grew. Oh, sorry, I really blew that. Um, Between 1926 and 1929, his legend grew, fueled by cafe gossip and a few articles and reviews in obscure Parisian occult journals. Cancelliet contributed more information. The master had indeed accomplished transmutation. Fulcanelli hadn't really disappeared. Another book or two was planned, and so on. After the war, Fulcanelli's legend and Cancelliet's career profited from an upsurge of interest in all things metaphysical. By the mid 1950s, conditions were right to reprint both Le Mystère des Cathedrals and Dwellings of the Philosophers. Simply by having been the mysterious Fulcanelli's student, Cancelliet had become the grand old man of French alchemy and esotericism. But the 50s were not the 20s, and many things had changed. One of those things was the text of Le Mystère itself. The Fulcanelli affair would be of interest only to specialists of occult history and abnormal psychology, except for the singular mystery of the extra chapter added in the 1957 edition of Le Mystère. This second edition included a new chapter entitled The Cyclic Cross of Hendai, and a few changes in its illustrations. No mention of these changes appeared in Cancelliet's preface to the second edition. With Cancelliet's use of everything else by Fulcanelli, how are we to account for the complete absence of reference to Hendai in Cancelliet's works prior to the mid-50s? In the chapter in the work of the illustrator Champagne, then Cancelliet must have known about it. This is not a trivial question. The Hendai chapter is perhaps the single most astounding esoteric work in Western history. It offers proof that alchemy is somehow connected to eschatology, or the timing of the end of the world, and it offers the conclusion that a quote unquote double catastrophe is imminent. If Cancelliet had known of this, he would surely have used it or at least mentioned it, yet the silence is complete and compelling. Quote, the cyclic cross at Hendai, it's just the, is just the title of the chapter, sorry, is the next to last or penultimate chapter of Fulcanelli's masterpiece. After wading through thickets of erudition and punning slang in the rest of Le Mystère, this chapter feels awash with the bright sunlight of its Basque setting. The description of the monument and its location is seemingly clear and direct. Even the explanation of the monument's apparent meaning is simple and virtually free of the green language code used throughout the rest of the book, or so it appears on the surface. We can date Fulcanelli's visit to Hendai in the early 1920s because of his comment on the, quote, special attraction of a new beach bristling with proud villas, end quote. H.G. Wells, Aldous Huxley, and the smart young London set discovered nearby St. Jean-de-Luz in 1920, and by 1926 or so, the tourist villas had spread as far south as Hendai. Today, Hendai plage, I guess, Plage, Hendai's beachfront edition bustles with boutiques, dive shops, and surfboard emporiums having become a popular stopover for the young international backpack nomad crowd. Although Fulcanelli declares somewhat disingenuously, quote, Hendai has nothing to hold the interest of the tourist, the archaeologist, or the artist, end quote. The region does have a rather curious history. A young Louis XIV met his bride on an island in the bay below Hendaye, along the boundary between Spain and France. Wellington passed through, making nearby St. Jean de Luz his base of operation against Toulouse at the close of the Napoleonic Wars. Hitler also paid a visit during World War II. In 1940, he parked his train car within walking distance of the cross at Hendaye. Quote, Whatever its age, the Hendaye cross shows by the decoration of its pedestal that it is the strangest monument of primitive millenarism, the rarest symbolic translation of Chileism which I have ever met. End quote. Coming from Fulcanelli, this is high praise indeed. He goes on to tell us that, quote, the unknown workman who made these images possessed real and profound knowledge of the universe, end quote. The cross sits today in a very small courtyard just to the south of the church. There is a tiny garden with a park bench nearby. Standing about 12 feet tall, the cyclic cross at Hendaye looms over the courtyard, a mysterious apparition in the clear Basque sunlight. The monument is brown and discolored from its 300-plus years. The stone is starting to crumble, and it is obvious that air pollution, the cross sits a few yards from a busy street on the main square, is speeding its dissolution. The image and the Latin inscription on the cross have no more than a generation left before pollution wipes the images clean and the message disappears forever. I can't quite see who that is, but someone just followed. Thank you very much. For some reason, it put it behind my um, captions. And why did my captions end? Stop. Did my caption... My Nope, it's there. Everything looks good there. Um, is this an anti-Masonic stream? No, not necessarily. I just read stuff about the Masons, good, bad, or indifferent. Um, I'm just reading whatever's in the book, and this one happens to be Forbidden History, and whatever the author has in mind. Um, but anyway, why are my captions not working? I don't understand. Are they still working on the other? Yeah, they're still working on the other page. I don't know. I'm going to stop them for a minute and restart them and see if that helps. Nope, it didn't. All right, well, sorry. I'm not going to mess with them right now. I'm just going to continue reading. Do you think Judeo-Masonic conspiracies have any credibility, or are mostly bullshit? Uh, I think I'd have to see more evidence to decide whether or not they were credible. I've seen lots of accusations. I've seen some stuff, um, like how the Masons on the in the English Army and the Masons in the Continental Army fighting in the American Revolutionary War were actually kind of conspiring. I'd like to see more of that. And as far as modern day stuff, I'd have to see more because I don't know. I haven't quite made up my mind on that yet. Okay, where were we when I? Okay, um, one generation before the message disappears forever. The base of local sandstone sits on a broad but irregular three-step platform and is roughly cubic. Measurements reveal that it is a little taller than it is wide. On each face are curious symbols: a sun face glaring like some ancient American sun god, a strange shield-like arrangement of A's in the arms of a cross, an eight-rayed sunburst, and, most curious of all, an old-fashioned man-in-the-moon face with a prominent eye. Rising from this is a fluted column with a suggestion of Greek classicism, on top of which stands a very rudely done Greek cross with Latin inscriptions. Above the sun face on the western side can be seen a double X figure on the top portion of the cross. Below that, on the transverse arm, is the common inscription O Crux. Uh, I'm just going to butcher this, I know. O Crux Avis Pe Unica, or Unica. Hail, O Cross, the only hope. On the reverse side of the upper cross, above the starburst, is the Christian symbol INRI. In the chapter, The Cyclic Cross at Hendai, Fulcanelli gives us a guided tour of this monument to the alchemy of time. He begins with the Latin inscription, which he interprets in French, translated here to English, from the Latin letters of the original as, "It is written that life takes refuge in a single space." Following this rendering, he casually suggests that the phrase means that a country exists where death cannot reach man at the horrible time of the double cataclysm. What is more, only the elite will be able to find this promised land. Falconelli moves on to the INRI, concluding, quote, "We have two symbolic crosses, both instruments of the same torture. Above is the divine cross, exemplifying the chosen means of expiation. Below is the global cross, fixing the pole of the northern hemisphere and locating in time the fatal period of the expiation." End quote. His esoteric interpretation of INRI, quote, "By fire is nature renewed whole," end quote, goes directly to the issue of chiliasm. I've never seen that word before in my life. CHILIASM. I'll look it up afterwards unless somebody happens to know what it means. And a cleansing destruction. Okay, let me start that sentence over. His esoteric interpretation of INRI, "by fire is nature renewed whole," goes directly to the issue of chiliasm and a cleansing destruction as a prelude to a recreated and Edenic world. Alchemy, according to Fulcanelli, is the very heart of eschatology. Such as gold is refined, so will our age be refined by fire. Fulcanelli concludes the chapter with a series of metaphors. Quote, "The age of iron has no other seal than that of death. Its hieroglyph is the skeleton, bearing the attributes of Saturn, the empty hourglass, symbol of time run out, and the scythe, reproduced in the figure 7, which is the number of transformation, of destruction, of annihilation." Fulcanelli instructs us, "The gospel of this," and this is continuing the quote, "the gospel of this fatal age is the one written under the inspiration of St. Matthew. It is the gospel according to science, the last of all, but for us the first, because it teaches us that, save for a small number of the elite, we must all perish. For this reason, the angel was made the attribute of St. Matthew, because science, which alone is capable of penetrating the mystery of things, of beings and their destiny, can give man wings to raise him to knowledge of the highest truths and finally to God. End quote. Because Falconelli so openly connected alchemy and the apocalypse, the true nature of a very specific Gnostic astro-alchemical meme emerged into public consciousness. This meant that the secret was no longer contained among the elect societies. For the first time since the age of the Gothic cathedrals, the meme had broken out of its incubation structures. I don't think he means meme by our modern um, definition, because this book is almost 20 years old. So um, unless the same concept of memes existed in, say, about 2001. Okay. In a way, the cross and its message serve as proof that there are such things as secret societies. Found throughout history, these societies preserve and present the secret of the cross in various ways. The Kabbalah in Judaism, Sufic Islam, esoteric Christianity, Gnosticism, and the Hermetic tradition have been the keepers of these ideas. The central message of the three main Western religions, that of an eschatological moment in time, is the secret that also lies at the heart of the cross of Hendai. That the meme, the ability to understand the myth and its metaphors, seems to have survived only through the actions of these secret and insular groups. The cross of Hendaye stands today at the southwest corner of St. Vincent's Church, the busiest street corner in town. No one notices the ordinary-looking monument with its message of catastrophe. Perhaps it was intended to be that way. The secret hides in plain sight. And that is the end of that article. Um, if you're not familiar with this book, by the way, Panda Man, this is a compilation of articles that were originally published in Atlantis Rising magazine. Um, Although some of them seem like they were sort of rewritten for the book. Um, but anyway, interesting. I have never read about Falconelli at all. Really don't know a whole lot about him other than what I just read. So I will have to look that book up, The Mystery of the Cathedrals, and see if I can get my hands on an electronic copy, because I just don't have the room for hard copies of all the books that I have or want to have. So um, I'll see if I can get an electronic copy, and maybe we'll read that at some point on this stream. I'm willing to read just about anything on this stream. In fact, um, I'm getting after this. I'm kind of wanting to take a break from the Templars and Christianity and all that. Not that I'm sick of that. I'm just kind of wanting to shift gears a little bit. I'm thinking of reading one of David Bryan Davis's books on slavery. I have almost all of his books. I have not read any of them. I just had a chance to pick them up for just a couple of bucks each, so I grabbed them up. Um, so yeah, I'll decide on one of those, and I think that may be the next book I read is one of his. Uh, but anyway, moving on. Um, the next article, Article 30, is Isaac Newton and the Occult. How important was the great scientist's hidden side? By John Chambers. So I'm just going to jump right on into that. And sorry, I'm messing with those stupid captions again, trying to get them to go. I don't know why they won't. But I guess it is what it is. Um, so, yeah, moving on. Wow. The great mathematician slash scientist Sir Isaac Newton lived from 1642 to 1727, and his towering Principia Mathematica paved the way for the Industrial Revolution. This work, together with the other seminal works of his, seems to be the very antithesis of New Age lore. The the visionary poet William Blake, who claimed to see and talk to angels daily, was only one of the long line of mystics stretching up to the present who despised Newton as the symbol of every kind of evil, superstition, and tyranny. In another expression of our times, the Wicca slash goddess slash feminist movement has long regarded the Englishman who invented calculus and discovered gravity as the embodiment of the patriarchal male scientist who is intent on controlling nature in much the same way as a master controls a slave. But it is becoming increasingly clear that Isaac Newton, whose formulations still provide the basis for virtually all practical science today, regularly drank deep at some of the same arcane sources as today's further out New Age theorists. Chief among these well springs was the ancient art of alchemy. It is now generally known that Newton, with Galileo, the very founder and paragon of modern exact science, was a deeply interested student of alchemy and an active laboratory worker for a large part of his life, leaving a mass of manuscripts on the subject still extant but not yet thoroughly described. Joseph Needham, in discussing Chinese alchemy in his monumental Science and Civilization in China, summarizes Newton's involvement in alchemy as follows. Quote, already in 1667, before his election as a Fellow of Trinity College, and soon after the time when at the height of his powers he had conceived the theory of universal gravitation, he was making chemical experiments privately, and between 1678 and 1696, after he had become, as quite a young man, Lucasian Professor of Mathematics, 1669, he spent a great deal of time in his own laboratory at the college. This was the period when he composed his comprehensive work on the motion of bodies, De Motu Corporum, 1685, and the Principia itself appeared in 1687. Needham cites the testimony of Newton's distant relative and assistant Humphrey Newton to the effect that the scientist rarely went to bed before 2 or 3 in the morning, sometimes not till 5 or 6. Fairly long quote here. At spring and fall of the leaf, at which time he used to employ about 6 weeks in his, I guess that's a typo, laboratory, um, the fire scarce going out either night or day, he sitting up one night and I another, till he had finished his chemical experiments, in the performance of which he was most accurate, strict, and exact. He would sometimes, though very seldom, look into an old mouldy book which lay in his laboratory. It did it twice, so it put um, an E on the beginning of the word laboratory, so a laboratory, I think. I think it was titled Agricola de Metallis, the transmuting of metals being his chief design, for which purpose antimony was a great ingredient. That's the end of the quote. Researchers have even suggested that Newton's obsessive delving into alchemy, he was not necessarily a true believer in the efficacy of the ancient art, but lived in a time when that art had not yet been discredited, was the cause of his mental breakdown, bordering on madness, which darkened further his so-called black year of 1693. Carrying out tests in the late 1970s, an example of Newton's hair, two researchers, P.E. Spargo and C.A. Pounds, concluded that unusually high levels of lead and mercury, the stock in trade of practicing alchemists, might have been responsible for this mental breakdown. It may well be that Newton's alchemical researches had a far more beneficial, even an indispensable effect on his scientific work than the conclusions of Spargo and Pound suggest. In a new book of unusual interest, Isaac Newton, the Last Sorcerer, British science writer Michael White, while not skimping on the more orthodox details of Newton's life, seeks to bring together many of the threads of the newest findings concerning the more unorthodox pursuits that were an integral part of Newton's multifaceted career. Not the least of White's often arresting assertions is that the scientist's huge knowledge and lengthy practice of alchemy may have planted in his imagination the seeds of a new way of looking at the universe that, growing to maturity, helped him to make the revolutionary leap to the wholly new idea of universal gravitation. White argues that the alchemical notion of active principles, which are rooted in Hermetic tradition, may have had this crucial influence on Newton's mind. Such ideas, writes White, for example, positing that matter and spirit were interchangeable and possessed what the early alchemists called a universal spirit, may have subtly conditioned the scientist eventually to be able to perceive gravity as operating by action at a distance, made possible by a form of active principle. Okay. And then we have a picture before I move on. A statue of Isaac Newton by Roubiliac at Trinity College, Cambridge, England. Oh, I'll go ahead and show you that. Focus. There we go. Kind of hard to see with all the whatever that board of names is behind. Not familiar with it. I'm not even sure I've ever even seen pictures of Cambridge campus beyond this. So I'm not familiar with that board behind him or that plaque. Okay, White points in particular to Newton's long years of labor at his preferred alchemical procedure, the purification of the metal antimony with iron to produce an amalgam or regulus called the star regulus of antimony. White states that this specific regulus, quote, does look like a star and its radiating shard-like crystals may be imagined as lines of light radiating from a star-like center, but the crystal may also as easily be visualized as representing shards or lines of light pointing inwards, a star at the center with lines of light or force traveling towards its center, end quote. The British science writer contends that Newton's long contemplation of the form of the star regulus of antimony worked on the scientist's mind, guiding him to the hitherto unheard of visualization of a gravitational force. Alchemy was not the only instance where the great scientist peered deeply into some aspect of ancient lore, or what was then called the occult. Like the early Renaissance Neoplatonists, Marsilio Ficino and Pico della Mirandola, and a century later Giordano Bruno, Newton believed that all present-day knowledge was the corrupted descendant of higher, even a perfected knowledge, dating back to the days of the ancient Egyptians and beyond. The Prisca sapientia, pristine wisdom, that sages and prophets like Pythagoras, Democritus, Solomon, Moses, and Moschus the Phoenician had possessed but had hidden in parable and symbol. Remnants of this perfected knowledge, or so it was believed, had been delivered to the court of Cosimo de Medici, in Italy in 1460 in the form of Corpus Hermeticum, a work thought to be from the hand of the god/seer and inventor of writing Hermes Trismegistus, and dating back to many millennia before Christ. It would not be until around the time of Newton's birth that savants began to realize that this supposed sacred text had been composed no earlier than the 2nd or 3rd centuries AD, but the author of the Principia believed all his life that the very first religion in the world, he thought it was Judaism, had been, quote, the most rational of all others until the nations corrupted it. For there is no way without revelation to come to the knowledge of a deity but by the frame of nature, end quote. Newton thought to discover just what that early unsullied frame of nature was. To that end, he was occupied throughout most of his life with deep, if unorthodox, studies in theology, the interpretation of the Hebrew prophetic books, biblical archaeology, and ancient chronology. Central to his studies was the belief that, in the words of White, the ancients had, quote, constructed temples and monuments as earthly representations of the universe. Examples of those still in existence may include some circles found throughout Europe and the Great Pyramid at Giza, end quote. This belief drove Newton to an enterprise not dissimilar to that of the modern-day Robert Bovell, who seeks to demonstrate that the arrangement and location of certain Egyptian pyramids were intended to mirror the location of certain stars. Believing that King Solomon was, quote, the great philosopher in the world, or greatest philosopher in the world, end quote, through the years, and by drawing upon all the ancient sources at his disposal, Newton sought to recreate the floor plan of the Temple of Solomon, originally built around 1000 BC. Excuse me. According to White, the great English mathematician/scientist, quote, described the heart of the ancient temple as a fire for offering sacrifices that burned perpetually in the middle of a sacred place, end quote. Newton imagined the fire as one around which the believers assembled, calling this arrangement Prytaneum, and describing the way in which the Prytaneum mirrored the cosmos in the following words, quote, the whole heavens they reckoned to be the true and real temple of God, and therefore, so that a Prytaneum might deserve the name of his temple, they framed it so as in the fittest manner to represent the whole system of the heavens, end quote. White believes that Newton's contemplation of the recreated shape of the Prytaneum may have stoked the powers of his creative imagination in much the same way as did his absorption in the occult pattern of the star Regulus of antimony. The British author asserts that in studying the image of the fire at the center of the Prytaneum, with disciples arranged around its flames, quote, instead of simply seeing the rays of light as radiating outwards from the fire, Newton might instead have visualized them as a force attracting the disciples towards the center, end quote. If this is so, then amazingly, Sir Isaac Newton actually did manage to discern the pattern of the real heavens as mirrored by the ancients in veiled fashion in the sacred architectural design of the Temple of Solomon. This immense preoccupation with discovering the true shape of the universe as encoded in the works of the ancients may not have been the final expression of Newton's obsessive researches into the occult. White asserts there is some slight reason to believe that the scientist also dabbled for a brief time in the so-called black arts. White bases this assertion on the suspicious burning of a manuscript that had been carried out by Newton, his devoted nephew-in-law John Conduit, and a helper named Krell only a few months before the scientist's death on March 20th, 1727. The author connects this event with Newton's highly emotional, perhaps sexual, and certainly mysterious relationship from 1690 to 1693 with the much younger scientist Nicolas Fatio de Dulier. Newton and de Dulier's correspondence during this period suggests that Newton and the younger scientist may have been involved in alchemical research of so forbidden a nature that they hardly dared speak of it to anyone. Though he didn't believe in evil spirits or demons, Newton probably understood very well the darker sides of the human mind. As author White puts it, quote, he may even have understood the potential of ritual, not because it could conjure up demons or devils or demons, but because it could focus energies in a way not dissimilar to the ritualistic element of alchemy, end quote. Since, quote, the concept of ritualistic concentration of psychic energy, end quote, was probably known to Newton's alchemist predecessors, says White, it is, quote, quite possible that Fatio tried to persuade Newton to experiment simply to learn what would happen, to explore another avenue of rediscovery at a time when Newton was desperate to elucidate a unified theory of the Principia Mathematica and the optics, end quote. Whether or not these experiments bore fruit, or of however twisted a nature, it is likely that they, and not merely Newton's daily exposure to lead and mercury, contributed significantly to his nervous breakdown of 1693. The breaking off of his relationship with de Dulier, which took place in that same year, probably also played a major role. There were deeper causes. As an infant, Newton had been traumatized by both the death of his father before he was born on Christmas Day and the necessity of his mother to give him over, when he was only 3, to his grandparents for raising. In 1693, the hypersensitive Newton, long under intense pressure to produce, may have begun to suffer the long suppressed and therefore all the more explosive effects of that emotionally impoverished childhood. His foray into the black arts, if it actually took place, may have been both a long delayed outcome of and an attempt to deal with the resurgent memories of those early barren years. There are other ways in which Newton seems to have come close to bursting the bonds of his own Newtonian universe. Astonishingly, perhaps prompted in part by the Hermetic dictum as above so below, he wondered if there might exist a realm of subatomic particles obeying the same laws of universal attraction as the macrobodies of the celestial sphere. Since the scientist had no way of proving this theory, such methods did not come along until the middle of our century. He confined himself to merely suggesting the existence of such particles in the list of queries included at the end of his Optics. As Joseph Needham explains, Newton carried the explanatory possibilities of his theory of light as invisible corpuscles so far that quote, he came very near to stating what today we would call the levels of subatomic particles, protons, electrons, etc., atoms themselves, and the molecules which they form. His aim was certainly to compass the extremes of size in the universe, from the minutest particle to the galactic scale, even though it was not possible for him to achieve it, end quote. By the time Newton composed his great Principia Mathematica, the scientist had come to the momentous conclusion that gravity was a force that seemed to act at a distance by some unknown mechanism, and that universal gravitation resulted in all the matter in the universe being attracted to all the other matter in the universe. But one point continued to trouble him. he had determined that if there were any ether to facilitate gravitation, then this ether must be almost a vacuum by nature and incorporeal in form. But then he pondered what was the exact nature of this incorporeal ether, and and how was it able to facilitate gravitation. Okay, there is a picture here before I go on, and I think we're almost done. Yeah, we got one more page after this. So, uh, Isaac Newton experiments with the qualities of light. So there we have experiments with the qualities of light. Newton was a Christian all his life, a believer in the sometimes, depending on the regime in power, dangerously heretical doctrine of Arianism, which held that there was no Holy Trinity, that God and Jesus Christ were separate, with Jesus standing in his essence midway between God and man. Based on this belief, Newton came to the conclusion, hardly an acceptable one to most modern thinkers, that the incorporeal ether that facilitated the phenomenon of gravitation and perhaps other forces was actually made up of the body or spiritual form of Jesus Christ. Einstein's theory of general relativity represents, along with much else, a complete revisualization of the notion of gravity, and renders all the more irrelevant the question of the existence and nature of the ether. But when we combine Newton's idea of spirit as both permeating and enabling the functions of time and space with his own probings into the possibilities of subatomic matter, we begin to move close to the contemporary notion of a zero-point energy field underlying all physical reality, and much more. Newton's achievement then is in both touching upon the realms of the occult and appearing to anticipate quantum theory seems not only colossal, it seems incommensurable. And it is perhaps best summed up in the words of the great British economist John Maynard Keynes, who was one of the first researchers to examine the records of Newton's alchemical pursuits, and who, in an address in which he introduced those findings to the public in 1942, said, quote, Newton was not the first of the age of reason. He was the last of the magicians, the last of the Babylonians and Sumerians, the last great mind which looked out on the visible and intellectual world with the same eyes as those who began to build our intellectual inheritance rather less than 10,000 years ago. Isaac Newton, a posthumous child born with no father, on Christmas Day 1642, was the last wonder child to whom the Magi could do sincere and appropriate homage. End quote and end article. So I don't think I have it in me to do a third article tonight, but I think next time I'll do all three. They're all about 6 pages apiece, whereas these were a little bit longer. So my voice starts to go after a while. So and I start to stumble more. So I think I can do 18 pages next time. That'll finish up this section of the book, and then we get into the spirit and the soul, and we've got however many articles are left in that. I'm not sure, but I believe that is the last section of the book, and they all seem to be relatively short articles. Just flipping through here. A couple of them are a little bit longer, but yeah. Okay, so the last article is a long one. the case for reincarnation, and that's Article 40. So that tells you how many we've got left. We've got 10 to go. So, all right, that'll be that for tonight. It's Thursday. I think I'm going to play some Oblivion next. So I'll end this session, and I will see you for the next reading in this book Sunday. I believe I have a meeting that night, so if it goes overly long, I may have to skip that reading and come back Tuesday. But if it goes its normal length, I'll be starting at maybe 10 o'clock with the reading, and we'll do that. So anyway, that is all. I will catch you all in the next session after a brief break. And thank you for coming in, Panda Man 821. I'll see you in the next one. Prepare to die.